Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for being so patient. I know we are a couple minutes late. We had some technical difficulties, but our AV staff was able to work it out. So we are here and we are ready to learn all about bioluminescence and the deep sea. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for Summer Kids Club. If you've been here with us all week, you know that every day at noon, we're doing programs for middle and high school students so that we can learn a little bit more about the ocean. Today, we're learning about bioluminescence, and Summer Kids Club is going to be continuing next week. So if you want to join in next week, you can join us again every single day next week, starting at noon for middle school and high school students. And then we have some of the younger kids have programming happening in the morning. So join us so that we can continue to explore our oceans. We're going to have all new topics next week, so definitely join us again. Now, I want to take a second to think about the deep sea. I'm joined today in the studio, by the way, by Jen, who's going to be helping control everything you see behind me. So she's going to be putting up some videos or some pictures of the deep sea, and I want you to think of what it is that you notice, and then you can send us a text or an email. I'm going to put this text number up right here, 562-286-1838, so that we can hear everything you have to say and answer any questions that you have about our deep sea. So let's take a look. What do you notice? First, you're probably noticing it's pretty dark, aren't you? So it is very, very dark in the deep sea. Once we get down farther into the deep sea, we get into areas that have no light. So this is lit by a submersible that's underwater, so they have a light. Otherwise, it would be completely dark, just like what we were just looking at. So let's take a look. Oh, all right, let's turn on those lights of the submersible one more time. Oh, there we go. I want to take a second we'll come back to this a little bit later, but right now I want to look at the habitat. So let's explore a little bit more about what the deep sea looks like. We were just looking at a picture of the deep sea. What is it that you notice? Take a look here. What observations do you have? What do you see? I know that I always think of the deep sea as being really barren, but there are actually areas where there's quite a bit. What type of conditions would you expect to find in the deep sea? We know already that it's dark. What else would you expect? How would it feel? If you were to go down to the very, very deepest part of the ocean, what would it feel like down there? Maybe you're thinking it would be very, very cold. It would be really cold. It would also be a lot of pressure. So the deeper you get, the more and more pressure that there is. Just like when you dive to the bottom of a swimming pool, you feel that pressure in your ears. We have a lot of pressure in the deep sea. Now, the animals that live in the deep sea have all these special adaptations. And these adaptations help them to exist in their habitat. So they are able to use these adaptations to exist in this cold, dark, high-pressure area. So I want to take a second to think of what are some of the challenges of living in the deep sea. What are some of the things that would be difficult? Here we have a crab. What are some of the things that would be difficult about living in the deep sea? So think of what it is that an animal needs to survive. They need food, right? How would it be hard to find your food in the deep sea? Maybe it's dark. Maybe there's not a ton of food available. The deep sea is kind of like a desert. There's not a ton of life down there. So maybe finding food is really challenging. Another challenge is that pressure that we talked about. That pressure can be crushing to a body. So how is it that they're able to survive that pressure? What are other challenges? Other challenges, predators. Just like every habitat, there are predators. So they have to find ways to be safe from their predators. And then lastly, finding a mate is really difficult. So again, if you are a fish and there's not that many fish around you and you're trying to find a mate, it can be really difficult if there's not that many around you. So these are all some of the challenges that deep sea animals face. But there are indeed habitats in the deep sea. I want to take a second to explore some of these habitats. Then once we're a little bit more familiar with the habitat and the challenges and the conditions in the deep sea, then we can dive into those adaptations. So the first habitat I want to talk about is a hydrothermal vent. So very cool. So this is an area where basically you have heat from the Earth's core coming up, kind of bubbling up at the surface. And the reason a hydrothermal vent is important is because this is an area where we're able to have primary production. What does that mean? Primary production. Now think if you're on land, the very, very base of the food chain, remember, are the plants. So the plants use the sunlight to produce energy. And then animals eat the plants, animals eat those animals. And that's how you're able to get that energy into the food chain. That's that primary production. But when you get into the deep sea, you don't have sunlight. So there's no photosynthesis able to happen here. So you can get energy in a couple different ways. One of that is energy coming in from the surface. So, dead animals floating down, other things like that. The other way you can get energy is by chemosynthesis. So this is basically, there are animals that live near this hydrothermal vent, or bacteria that live near this hydrothermal vent, and they are able to use the chemicals from the hydrothermal vent to be able to produce energy. So in the same way that a plant uses light from the sun to produce its food, they are able to use the chemicals from this hydrothermal vent to produce their food. So that's one example of a habitat that we can find in the deep sea. Here's another great view of it. You can see the hydrothermal vent. These are the areas where that really, really warm water comes up. It's kind of steaming out from the darkness below. And I think we might have a graphic too that kind of shows how these hydrothermal vents work. Perfect. So here you can see here are these hydrothermal vents, and basically the cold seawater seeps into the floor where there's a lot of heat coming from the center of the earth, and it's able to push that heat, and that warm water goes back up. And then this is that formula for chemosynthesis. So again, just like plants use the light on the land to produce that sugar, that you might remember this if you've done your high school biology. Those of you that are in high school, you might remember this C6H12O6. So they're producing the same thing. They're producing that food in the same thing. It's just a different chemical process. So that's one really important underwater habitat that we're going to look at. The other one that we're going to look at is a whale fall. So remember how I mentioned how nutrients and food can come down from the surface? One way that happens is when really large animals die, they sink to the bottom and they create these things. So this example is a whale fall, but it could be for sharks or seals or other big animals. When they die, they float to the bottom, and all these other animals will come and they'll feed off of it, and creates this whole habitat, this whole ecosystem all around it. And it goes through all these different phases. So maybe at first you have big scavengers coming in and eating the meat, and then you have these kind of smaller scavengers. Look at all these octopus that are able to come in and feed. And then the very last phase of it is you have all these worms that live in the bones. This is another one of those really important habitats. Now remember, there is a light here that is shining this bright light, so it would be completely 100% dark. You would not be able to see any of this. But you can see there's lots of different types of fish that are living here, lots of octopus. If we look closely, you might sometimes be able to find things like crabs, sometimes even things like sea stars as well. So just kind of keep an eye out, see what you can find. Look at those octopus. There's so many of them. You can see there's very cool. Okay, so there's a zoomed out view of it. So you can see from up above, you can see how dark it is, except for that area where that light is shining. So really, really cool. So that's another example of a habitat. So we've looked at some of the habitats in the deep sea. We've talked about some of the conditions in the deep sea, and we've talked about some of the challenges for life in the deep sea. Now we're going to take a closer look at some of the adaptations that animals living in the deep sea might have. The first one is that a lot of animals, like these octopus that you see here, don't have bones. And the crabs, you can see there's some crabs there. So a lot of the animals in the deep sea don't have bones. Why would that be beneficial? How would that help them to survive? So here's an example of one of these animals that doesn't have bones. Remember the word for animals that don't have bones? They're invertebrates. So these are invertebrates, things like crabs, sea stars, sea urchins, invertebrate. So here's an example. How is that beneficial? Let's go ahead and put that number back up. So if you have an answer or if you have a question, you can go ahead and text us right here. Here's another example. This is a giant isopod. Looks kind of like a roly-poly you might see in your garden, but they get to be about, 1.5 feet, 2 feet long. They get to be pretty big. So a little bit bigger than a roly-poly you might find. So the reason that these animals a lot of the deep sea animals are invertebrates, they don't have bones, is because they live in this area with all this crushing pressure. So with all this pressure on them, having no bones can be a benefit to survival in that area. There are, of course, we did see lots of fish on that whale fall. So there are, of course, fish that live down there as well, but their bodies are just adapted to live under that high pressure. So if you brought them up to the surface, they would not fare well. They need to be under that pressure. Another adaptation that we end up seeing is look at the eyes of this animal. What do you notice about the eyes? They're pretty big. So something that you'll see when you look at the deep sea is that most animals that you see that have eyes are either going to have very, very big eyes or they're going to have very, very small eyes. And that is basically they've taken a couple of different methods of survival. So if they have really, really big eyes, then what they're doing is they are putting that energy into growing those really big eyes so that they can see really well. So they live in a place where it's totally dark, but they have pretty good eyesight to account for the fact that it's so dark. Others will have very, very small eyes. So they evolutionarily, their eyes have gotten so tiny because they basically are not going to use their eyesight to be finding their food or finding mates or avoiding predators. They're using their other senses. So we end up seeing either animals with big eyes or animals with small eyes. One other really cool adaptation is that you end up seeing a lot of red animals in the deep sea. I'm saying, why would you see red animals? The reason for that is that when you're looking at the light coming in from the surface, remember there's all different wavelengths, and some wavelengths travel much deeper, some wavelengths do not. So red is actually the very first color out of the rainbow that you lose when you go down deep. In fact, if you were to scuba dive, even just to like 35 or 40 feet deep, that red that a person would be wearing, if you're wearing like a red bathing suit or a red wetsuit, that red would start to look brown and then black. So being red in the deep sea is the same as being like black in the deep sea. It basically helps you blend in because only when there's light shine, that's the only time it actually looks red. Otherwise it looks really dark, so it's able to blend in really well with the darkness around it. So that's another example. Now, one of the most exciting adaptations, of course, before we actually talk about that, look at this crazy animal. Look at how cool this is. It's got all these like kind of spines on its body to protect itself. Very cool. Okay, so I want to talk about the coolest adaptation in the deep sea, the one that I think a lot of us think about really frequently when we think of the deep sea, and that is bioluminescence. What does that mean, bioluminescence? I think Jen's going to give us a little hint at what bioluminescence means. Look at that. So this animal we were looking at earlier has a special skill. It has the ability to use bioluminescence. So in this instance, it's basically using it. It kind of shoots out that bioluminescence as a way of like confusing their predators or their prey so that they're able to either escape from a predator or they can catch their prey more easily. So that brings us to why do animals, I guess, what is it? Bioluminescence is light that's created by animals. So there's a process in their body where they have basically an enzyme that reacts with a protein and that causes the production of light. So this light is being produced by these animals. They are able to make that light, which is really cool. So why is it that they would want to use this light? They might use it like this as a way of confusing their predators or confusing their prey. It can help them sometimes hide from predators. It might help attract prey. It could even help them attract mates. And then it can also be used for communication. So let's take a look at a couple of different examples of bioluminescent animals. This is a type of jelly that is bioluminescent, so you can see all of this. So we end up seeing bioluminescence appearing in lots of different types of animals. We see it in things like jellies. We just saw it in that shrimp. We can see it in things like fish. So lots of different types of animals have this bioluminescence. Let's take another look. This is a pyrosome, so this is another example. Look at this. Yeah, it's a sea pickle. Let's see, what other animals can we see that are bioluminescent? Oh, this is really cool. So this is what it looks like with light on it, and then this is what it looks like when it's bioluminescing. So this is a type of coral. You might think corals live only in shallow waters, but there are some corals that live in the deep sea. The difference is that they don't have that algae inside of it to do photosynthesis and produce food for it. So instead, they're able to catch their food. So this could be a way of helping to attract their prey. You can imagine if you were a little fish and you saw something like that, you might be pretty interested by it. This is a worm. This is some type of worm. So again, you can see this really beautiful coloration. So this is like the only light that you end up seeing in the deep sea, is this light that is created by these animals. Now we're going to take a closer dive into the light created by a particular type of animal, an ostracod. So Jen's going to put a picture of an ostracod up here for us. Ostracods are very, very tiny, tiny plankton. So they float in the water. And this is a particular type of ostracod. Now, like I said earlier, bioluminescence is created by a chemical reaction. Basically, you have a protein and an enzyme, and the protein and the enzyme react, and that creates light as one of the byproducts. So what we're going to do is we are going to be watching an experiment where they take ostracods that have been dried up. You can see them there here in this little container. Now the lights have just gone off, and they're going to be adding water, and the water is going to trigger that reaction. So watch. Now all of those little tiny bits of blue that you see, that is the bioluminescence created by the ostracods. Now the water movement is created by, you can see that there's a pipette with water being poured out into there, but so the water movement, we'll watch that one more time. So the water movement is not being created by the ostracods, it's being created by the person that's adding water. So she has this little bowl, and she's going to add water to it, and we're going to see that bioluminescence one more time. Let's watch. There it is. So these ostracods have the ability to do a chemical reaction inside their body that produces light. How cool is that? Now, one of the really cool things about the deep sea is how much we've been able to learn about it. So the deep sea, there are fewer people that have been to the deepest part of the ocean than have been to the moon, which is so, so crazy because it's here on our Earth, and there's a lot that we don't know about it. Now, these days, most research of the deep sea happens by unmanned submarines. So we're no longer in that stage of science where we're sending people in a submarine down to the bottom of the ocean. It's a little bit too dangerous. It's really expensive, and it requires basically to be able to put a person in a submersible. It's a lot easier to send a submersible down to the bottom of the ocean when the people stay on the boat that is on the water. So this is an example of one of those submersibles. A lot of them actually are work by like a tether system. So there's one big submersible, and then there's a smaller submersible attached to it, and that smaller one can get a lot closer. It's a lot more maneuverable. Usually a lot of the collection materials and tools are going to be located on that smaller one. But there are some that are just a single submersible that goes down, and you can see this submersible, it's like, gosh, probably a little bit bigger than like a big car, a little bit bigger than like a big Suburban. And the entire thing is filled with tools. So tools for being able to move through the water, and then also tools for collection. And that's what you can see if you look closely. You end up seeing a lot of tools. Here's like a claw for collection. There's lots of different mechanisms for collecting different types of things. This is the Sebastian. It's from Schmidt Ocean Institute, and they have these canisters so they can get water samples and maybe collect things that are in the water. They're also like big claws so they can grab onto things. There's things where they can use to collect the sediment or the seafloor. And all this allows the scientists to learn more about the ocean. And then, of course, just looking at what you're able to see, so capturing that video. So having like big lighting and video capability is another really important way to be able to learn more about the deep sea. Now let's take a closer look into how this thing is driven. We know that there's not a person on there, so instead they use, this is basically like a joystick, and they use this joystick, and it's incredibly sensitive, and that's what they use to be able to control the movements of like those arms that you saw. So you can imagine one of those arms might try to grab like a very fragile rock or a shell or something like that, and it has to be able to pick up that shell and put it into a container and bring it back up to the surface. So there is someone on this boat using that little joystick that you saw, picking up this really delicate piece of coral so that we can study it and we can learn more about this particular type of coral and more about the deep sea. Now, that's not the only person controlling this. There's actually a whole operating room, basically, a whole room full of people that are controlling the various maneuvers. So if anyone out there is big fans of like playing video games or anything like that, this is a potential career for you. There are engineers that basically are able to control all the fine movements. You can see all these little different joysticks and controls so that they're able to manage the